Speaking of Spider-Man, I was talking to my old colleague from Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with him on Spider-Man. I was telling him about the book, and we were talking about the Beatles. And he just completely out of the blue, he said, I was reading this great book about Revolver. He said, I read it like a couple of times already. And he goes, the author, he says, I'm trying to remember the author's name. And he goes, oh yeah, Robert Rodriguez. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I said, I'm doing his show next week.
Wow.
And he said, please, he says, when you do it, please tell him that Ralph Macchio was very, very impressed with his book.
Ralph Macchio?
Yeah, not the Karate Kid.
Okay, I was going to say, what the hell?
Not the Karate Kid. No,
that's a feather in the cap.
Yeah, that's Ralph Macchio. Same spelling, same spelling. No, this was a guy.
But he gets that a lot.
Yeah, he does.
Uh-huh.
This was a guy, he worked at Marvel for about 35 years.
Uh-huh.
So,
in what capacity?
He was an editor, and a lot of the stuff that's actually hitting the screen now
passed through him?
Yeah.
Wow.
And wrote in some capacity.
Holy cow, that's amazing.
It is. It's something. I mean, my stuff has never made it onto the big screen, but there's some stuff that I had a hand in that it's kind of exciting to just be a part of it.
No kidding. That's great.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. My most bizarre Revolver story is my nephew was out of college, hired by the Milwaukee Brewers, and he worked in corporate sales there. And one of his top reports was I think the CSO of the Brewers, a guy named Rick Schlesinger, who is way up there. And he was in his office one day, and there's the Revolver book sitting there.
Wow.
And he just, my nephew, very matter-of-factly goes, oh, my uncle wrote that.
That's awesome.
And Rick looks at him and goes, oh, I get it. Ha ha, Rodriguez, I get it. Ha, yeah, that's your uncle. And he goes, no, my uncle wrote that. And Rick do you think he would sign it? And it led to me getting invited to the Brewers games to sit in the box there. So that was pretty cool, actually.
Oh, that's
Talk
awesome.
Beatles with the guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he was he totally didn't believe that the person writing that book would be related to somebody working for his organization.
Well, it's a smaller world than we think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is a really cool topic in that it's so covered by, it seems like a go-to thing that a lot of Beatle people really want to dig into and have that bit of speculation on what they would have done had history been a little bit different. And to me, it's interesting. It's always been interesting in studying their history, how many songs for those first couple years, and sometimes even well beyond, that they were recording as solo artists that might have been Beatle material because they existed at least in some form during the Beatle years.
Right.
There's so many things that they just kept in their pocket and developed much later on. I think one of the more interesting ones is Beautiful Girl from 33 and a Third, that George started that song, I think in 67, and he started it about Patty and he finished it about Olivia.
That's very funny.
Yeah. So it is a really cool thing that it seems like they generally didn't let a good idea, or at least a germ of a good idea, go unused. Eventually they got around to it. And when you're as prolific as Paul, all kinds of things that pop up in Twickenham, odd things like In the Palace of the King of Birds or something like that they play more than once. And then eventually it surfaces as part of the Rupert Project. So it's kind of a cool thing that they sort of filed the stuff in their brains and then eventually get around to it if they're digging for material. They need something to work with.
Yeah, all of my favorite artists end up doing that. I mean, Pete Townsend has been recycling and rethinking and reusing stuff from the Lifehouse album.
Oh, yeah.
And even Brian Wilson, he finally got around to using Can't Wait Too Long on, I think it was his last solo album, No Peer Pressure.
Okay.
And that song's been around since 1967.
Holy cow. Wow.
It's really incredible, number one, that it took so long for them to get to it.
Uh-huh.
And number two, that they finally got to it.
Yeah.
This is when you sort of give up on it, because that song has existed as a bootleg for years and years and years.
Something that they tracked as a group, or did you just demo it and then they set it aside?
They recorded it as a group, but I think at that point, Brian just had no idea what to do with it. It was post-Smile.
Oh.
But it sounded very much like their early to mid-60s. It sounds very much like something that would have been right at home on their Surf albums.
Okay.
It has that kind of groove to it, but it was recorded in late 67, 68. So this was past the Smile period.
And they're kind of scrounging for material.
Yeah, and it was just this beautiful, it's like a choral thing with just them sort of doing harmonies, but no lyrics.
Okay.
And it was just gorgeous. And he actually got around to using it with different singers, of course,
Right.
on his most recent solo album.
Well, that makes sense as something that would have a longer shelf life on it, because if it's not lyrically tied to something ridiculous from the mid-'60s,
Right.
then absolutely you could return to that well. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
The one that I was aware of was Darlin', that I guess he wrote the song and produced it. Was like a girl group or somebody that did it?
Yep.
It bombed. And then that period, what was it, late 67 that they resurrected that, or 68?
It was 67 for the Wild Honey album, and Mike just went in and just rewrote the lyrics, and Brian changed the melody a little bit. But yeah, it's basically a remake.
Mm-hmm. Give these guys credit for recognizing this is a good idea, and maybe if we just work with it, push it a little bit harder, we can come up with something there.
Exactly, yeah.
So do we have any particular ground rules for speculating on post-Abbey Road Beatles?
I do.
Okay, good.
I was actually emailing my friend Jam DeMattis, who I told you about last time we spoke.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who met John Lennon a couple of times in the 70s.
Oh, okay.
He's a rock journalist, a musician, comic book writer, and screenwriter. His theoretical Beatles thing was a full second double album that would have been released around 1972, 73. And his theory was they took a break, they got away from each other for a little while, and they came back and they did a double album.
So in this parallel universe, did the releases that actually came out, like was there Plastic Ono Band and Imagine and a Ram and all that stuff? Or did they do something else in that parallel universe?
I think in his parallel universe, there wasn't. In my parallel universe, there wasn't either. But he counted Instant Karma as a Beatles song.
Oh, interesting.
Whereas I don't, because that came out technically when the Beatles were still together.
Right. And it's half a Beatles song, if you want to get technical, as is Cold Turkey.
Right. And I think he included Cold Turkey also, which I do not.
Uh-huh.
So I'm pretty strict.
Yeah. That one, it's a tough one. I thought about including that in one of my things, like the Beatles had picked it up, but I guess the mental parameter I imposed on myself was fall of 69 proceeded as it did through the end of the year.
Right.
And then I guess I sort of picked it up like anything through. Now, this is where it gets a little dicey because you got McCartney coming out in April and Let It Be coming out in May. But I kind of like ended the Beatles in May and McCartney necessarily for what I wanted to include in my visions. It didn't exist in the form it came out in.
Right. I agree with you. Yeah. You can't do this without Every Night, Maybe I'm Amazed, So my theory is, it's sort of like my divergent point is September 69, where they have that meeting where John suggests, I do 4 songs, Paul does 4 songs, George does 4, we give Ringo 1 or 2, and Paul goes along with it. Just to keep John happy, Paul goes along with it.
Right.
So they do take a break from each other to sort of settle down after Abbey Road. September comes by, 1970 comes. The one release that they'll put out in 1970, in my mind, is Let It Be. Maybe it comes out in April, as the Beatles originally planned.
Yes.
Then we go into late 70 or early 71, and that's where my theoretical albums begin.
Okay, good. In my parallel universe, there were certain key songs that, in my head at least, I kept to them as solo artists because a big part of my thinking was, well, what songs would have benefited from Beatle participation, as well as did they have room for the Beatles to contribute something meaningful? And sometimes it was a tough call. Because like the first time I ever heard Maybe I'm Amazed, I thought, God, he's playing a George part there. The lead guitar, that arpeggio part. I was thinking, that sounds so like something George would play. Mm-hmm. And maybe if the Beatles had recorded it, Paul would have said, George, here's how it goes. Right. I want you to play this.
Yeah.
Or nothing at all. But in my head, I decided, for criteria that's unique to my vision of things, I decided Paul would have put that out in 1970 as a solo single, just to kind of keep up with his bandmates that were all doing solo projects. And so the McCartney album really did come out as this half-assed experimental musical doodlings thing, and it didn't have the good tracks on it, like the most fully realized. Mm-hmm. That was how I saw things. It kept it pure in concept rather than what did come out, which is, we talked about in the show before, I believe in my heart of hearts was informed by Instant Karma. And that's when he stepped up his game and did something beyond what had been the tone of that semi-experimental thing to that point.
Yeah, I could totally see that. I mean, I basically, to keep this going, I mined the McCartney album as much as I could. I mean, I just came at it from a different...
Yeah.
I think I basically pretended that the McCartney album, never would have happened.
Okay.
Or if it did, like you said, it would have been all the experimental stuff and maybe some more.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because God knows he's got that by the ton.
Right. Looking at my track list for the first one, which is probably the purest one, it's probably the least theoretical.
Mm-hmm.
And the McCartney songs that I have on that are Maybe I'm Amazed, Junk.
Mm.
And because of the time frame, like again, I placed this in 71.
Okay.
We're kind of getting into Ram territory a little bit. So I included Another Day.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Every Night and Teddy Boy, just because, Teddy Boy, he's been trying to get that onto a Beatles album since I think the White Album.
Yeah, I believe it's written in India, and then they bring it up at Twickenham.
Right.
And then or Apple Studio, rather.
And in terms of Every Night, I made sure I got that one. Number one, because it's a great song.
Mm-hmm.
But also because I think that George and or Ringo praised it. Even though they slammed the McCartney album, they reserved some kind words for, I believe it was Maybe I'm Amazed,
Mm-hmm.
Every Night. And George in particular, I'm sure you know this, had nice words to say about That Would Be Something.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I put on my next one.
Okay. I'm assuming you've got a sequence to it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
What I tried to do with each one was have a kind of flow. For one thing, how do the songs sound when they flow into one another?
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I thought about was, as much as I could, pattern them after pre-existing Beatles albums with a track flow. So with the first one that I did, the 1971 one, I patterned it after Revolver.
Okay.
So I kicked it off with What Is Life? Because I thought that's a great album opener, the same way Taxman was a great album opener. And,
Absolutely.
and after Abbey Road, after the performance that George did on Abbey Road, let him have the opening track.
Absolutely. Especially if we're living in this 4-4-4-2 world where they're splitting things a little bit more democratically.
With this one, because of the strength of the John and Paul songs for this first one, I gave George 2, only 2. But George has the opening track and the closing track.
Oh, wow.
So it begins with What Is Life, and it ends with All Things Must Pass, because I feel that that is a great way to end the album. There's nothing you can put on after that one.
Yes.
In this kind of sequence. So that was the sort of like my way of sort of like apologizing to George for only giving him 2, just because the John and the Paul stuff is so essential.
Remind me, off the top of my head, isn't that the closer to side 2 and All Things Must Pass?
I've never listened to All Things Must Pass on vinyl, so I couldn't tell you.
It closes a side.
Okay.
And there'll be a million listeners shouting right now saying, you idiot, it's in side 3 or something like that. But I know it's a side closer. And so I get where you're coming from, that it absolutely has like a resolution to it where it seems to be the kind of thing to end with, even if it's just a side.
Right. When I look at this first one, a lot of the John songs are very soft, very much about love and all that. So, I've got Jealous Guy.
Mm-hmm.
I've got Oh My Love. You can't get much more soft than that. Or Love. So I stuck on Give Me Some Truth. Number one, because I know it was considered for a Beatles track.
Absolutely. And that's one that I totally saw as, when you hear that little snippet of them doing it together, Twickenham and Paul joining in and being just as fully invested in that, it just sounds like something that would have been something that absolutely would have benefited from John and Paul on it. Plus, in the finished version, you got George on lead anyway. So it's one of these near Beatles songs to begin with.
Exactly. And then for Ringo, I think it's pretty obvious. It Don't Come Easy.
Yes.
So that's it. And the thing is that the other ground rule that I made for myself is, and it didn't occur to me until a friend of mine a few years ago, because originally I had like 18 tracks on this thing.
Oh, wow.
And a friend of mine said, well, they couldn't fit 18 tracks on a vinyl album in 1971. You're going to have to pare it down if you really want to make this accurate. I thought about it. I was like, yeah, you're right. So given the lengths of the songs, because I'm not going to go in and start editing pre-existing Beatles songs. I mean, the song lengths of the song length.
Yes.
So I whittled it down to 12. And so that pretty much rounds out the first album. It's 12 tracks. And it comes to it's probably a little longer than a vinyl album could sustain.
London Town had an awful lot of space on it. Wasn't it like 45 minutes or something like that?
Oh, I believe so. And I was doing some research on this, and there's a Todd Rundgren album, I believe, where the entire side 2 is 30 straight minutes. Wow. but you lose sound quality.
Right,
because
exactly.
the grooves have to get so much thinner.
So you could do a Johnny Winter and have a 3-sided album.
That was my first attempt, and this has been a work in progress since like 1987, I think.
Oh, wow.
And I finally, this first one that I did, I finally have reached, I think, my last word on this particular subject.
Okay. This is the final revision.
This is the final revision that I did I'd say about 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't changed it since, so I guess I'm happy with it.
Okay.
That would be the 1971 album, which again, this was 1987 when I started this project.
Mm-hmm.
I called it Odds and Ends because I really did think it was the only one I was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I called it Odds and Ends because the Beatles were at odds with each other and they were coming to an end.
Oh, very good. Nice.
But then I did 2 more, so.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah, exactly. Shall I go on or
Yes.
do you want to? Okay.
Well, okay. So let's hear the rundown of this revised.
Okay. So Odds and Ends is What is Life?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm Amazed. Jealous Guy. It Don't Come Easy. Give Me Some Truth. Oh, and then ends with Junk. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Then side 2 begins with Another Day. Then we go into Oh My Love, Every Night, Teddy Boy, Love, and then we go right into All Things Must Pass. I think Love is the perfect setup for All Things Must Pass.
Wow, interesting.
Just from a sonic quality.
Yeah, I'm wrapping my head around that right now. Pretty cool. The one thing that I wonder if given, and again, this sort of informed my thinking. So this will explain to you why I left Teddy Boy on the alternate universe version of Mccartney in 1970 is when they had that conversation, they talked about, well, wouldn't it be better if we gave away songs that we didn't all dig?
Yeah.
Yeah. And since Mary Hopkin refused Teddy Boy, Paul ended up recording himself.
Yeah. If I were to account for that McCartney album coming out, which I don't think I accounted for when I came up with this list, I may have, because John couldn't help but really make fun of Teddy Boy during the Get Back sessions. He was doing a square dance.
Yes, exactly. Which is the best part of that song I've ever heard.
Yeah, obviously the song meant something to Paul.
Yeah.
And I could just see him nagging them or being so passive aggressive that they finally he just wears them down and they say, fine, we'll do it.
They do an obla-dia-blah-da on it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
Yeah, so that's where that came up with.
Okay, so that's the revised version of your 1970 album, Odds and Ends.
70-71, yeah.
Yeah, 70-71. Okay, cool. So I was trying to come up with a good title for mine, which I pictured as being, in my parallel world, McCartney comes out, it's strictly unfinished music number 3. There is no fully realized tunes on it. I did have John do a Plastic Ono Band that is his direct Primal album, but it's purely stuff that I thought was extremely personal to him. And on that album, he does a slow piano version of Help.
Oh, wow.
So I have him because we know that he talked about it. There's a tape of him doing it and he forgets the chords to it.
Right.
But here we have Spector pulling it out of him and he gets it done. And the reason I did that was so that I could steal Love off that album and put it on my Beatle album. Because that's a song that I saw as, this is one thing off that album that's so universal, not directly Primal or Yoko-centric, that the Beatles could have done and made a standard out of.
Right.
So anyway, I didn't give it a title other than I thought provisionally just call it Love. But I thought, well, wait a minute. What if 30 years from now they do a Cirque du Soleil show and they need to call it something? So I better rethink that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really cool.
So here's my track order on that. And I made it, I tried to stick, again, to the 4-4-2 thing. But then in my parallel universe, I had George, ever the buddy of Ringo, give up one of his 4 and give it to Ringo. So technically, maybe it is a Harris song, but Ringo gets to sing it. So
right.
It opens with Apple Scruffs, which I always thought some McCartney harmonies on that would have been a really cool song to come from the Beatles.
Yep.
Followed by Every Night, followed by Love, then Another Day, It's So Hard. So you get one of these gritty John Lennon guitar songs that isn't necessarily so super personal. It's just more of a kind of a genre exercise. And side 1 with Backseat of My Car. Again, a Twickenham piano-based song. It wouldn't have had Linda on it necessarily, but it would have still been a nice little McCartney ballad with some balls behind it with the Beatles on it.
And we know that the Beatles like that song.
That's right. Although John was questioning that whole refrain of "we believe that we can't be wrong," thinking about it in terms of the lawsuit is like yet another message to him to justify How Do You Sleep. So side 2 opens with It Don't Come Easy. So another Hair song, if you will, otherwise Ringo vocal at least. Then the great McCartney, Lennon, Harrison that never was, Give Me Some Truth. And then for my Harrison criteria, I was thinking that the pattern seemed to be after January of 69, when he was submitting material to the Beatles, he tended to shelve the most personal, meaningful stuff and just contribute either the lightweight stuff or the most commercial stuff. So that's why you see them taking on An Old Brown Shoe or For You Blue or Here Comes the Sun or something, rather than the stuff he had in his pocket, like Isn't It a Pity and Hear Me Lord, things like that, that clearly were heavy stuff, sort of ponderous and had some meaning to them. So I take those out of the Beatle equation. I have him as a lightweight thing that maybe the Beatles could have done justice to. I Dig Love. Followed by, and that's a piano song, so then I follow it with a McCartney piano song that existed in 71, Tomorrow.
Okay.
And it'll be a different song because it won't be with the Linda co-vocal so high in the mix.
Right.
And then, because things are different in this Beatle world, they're not at each other's throat the way they were in real life. I've got the original draft of How Do You Sleep?
Wow.
Which was called Since You Came to Me.
Okay.
When he originally conceived it, and there was a demo of it, and that's all he's got. And then for the verses, he's singing the words to rock and roll music, Chuck Berry, as placeholders. But otherwise, the melody is exactly the same. So, again, you get the George Harrison guitar solo, as is on the finished version, but you don't have the McCartney character assassination going on. And it's just a nice John Lennon love song with all the Beatles on it. And concluding track, I've got What Is Life? Because I thought, uber commercial, nice George song that, again, I thought would be really cool to have all the Beatles on it.
Absolutely. That would have been an amazing Beatles track.
Yeah, for sure.
That's really interesting about How Do You Sleep. I specifically left off on all of my compilations any songs that they snipe at each other. Even though the songs would have existed in a different form.
Yes.
When I'm listening to it, I don't want to have to think about, I have to like sort of mentally change the lyrics, So as much as I love, and I truly, truly love Too Many People, I didn't utilize it at all.
Same here.
I didn't utilize How Do You Sleep? Whereas I did utilize, because it's so oblique, I did utilize Wah Wah.
Yeah.
We'll get to that shortly. And I didn't utilize early 1970. It's just too on the nose.
Yes, exactly.
So I left that stuff off.
For the same reason I didn't utilize Run of the Mill.
Right.
Yeah, which I would have loved to have, because that's another one of these great songs that I love. But in my parallel universe, All Things Must Pass came out, only it was called Beware of Darkness, and it was a single disc.
Okay.
It still did well for George. So that's what I had for that album, which provisionally called Love or Love One, not knowing what's coming down the road years later, but that's what I got. So now your next one is 72?
Late 71 or 72. I resisted doing this one for the longest time, and then I said, the hell with it. And I just kind of I broke down the walls a little bit and, agreed with myself to be a little bit more conjectural. So I called this next one Imagine the Beatles. Perfect title, I thought. So anyway, kicks off with Imagine.
Group treatment.
Yep, group treatment. Goes right into Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey.
Oh, interesting.
Which really sounds terrific. The flow from one into the other. With Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, I did the album track rather than the single. So it has that sort of guitar futzing around at the end. Burn it, burn it, burn it at the end on the album track.
Oh, interesting.
And that goes right into, without skipping a beat, it goes right into Let It Down.
Oh, cool.
And it sounds incredible. Yeah, the flow just works terrific.
That's interesting, because on Ram, the album, you've got it followed by Smile Away, which is another heavy guitar-driven song.
Exactly.
It's like, that's the way to go, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I go into Back Off Boogaloo, which wasn't released until 72, but it was written in 71, so again, I'm conjecturing that they finished it quicker.
Right. And again, it's pretty much George's involvement's pretty heavy in that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's plausible.
And if it is about Paul, it's oblique enough that...
Yeah, that's the thing. It's funny, you had that as a rule, and I was thinking about some of the stuff I was looking at where other people were doing their versions of these post-1970 Beatle albums. And I can't remember if it was Spencer Leigh, who's been on the show before, the Liverpool radio guy and massive writer of Beatles stuff. On his version, which he called Finishing School. Did you read about that one?
No.
Oh, yeah. So he's got on there. He put together his compilation called Finishing School. And the person whose blog I was reading it on was ripping it to pieces for how implausible it was. Because one of his tracks he had on there was Not Guilty. And they're like, right, 102 takes to that, and 2 years later, they're going to put it on an album. Yeah. Because it is in that territory of slagging each other off, however obliquely. So, yeah, I don't see the Beatles redigging that one up.
Although the Beatles versions I find to be much more enjoyable than the George solo version from 79.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting take, but that heavy guitar and then the harpsichord on top of it, I like the fact that they were juxtaposing strange things.
So after Back Off Boogaloo, I go into Look at Me.
Oh.
So we've got a kind of mellow John song. Sometimes what I try to do with these things is have the John songs and the Paul songs, the ones that are consecutive, kind of complement each other or kind of echo each other.
Speak to each other?
To some extent. So
yeah,
I have Look at Me, and then I go with That Would Be Something.
Interesting.
Which is another kind of mellow Paul song. Then, starting side 2 is Wah Wah, because I think that's just a great way to kick off side 2. And then How by John. And then, and I've got a funny story as soon as I get through this, Eat at Home by Paul. Eat at Home is like a fun little jaunt. Crippled Inside, if you take away the lyrics, that's a fun song.
You've heard the song it was cribbed from, right? At the Twickenham sessions, or maybe it was the Apple Studio sessions, something called Black Dog Blues, like this 1920s record. And a lot of the melody is taken wholesale from it. Maybe he thought it was public domain, like he would with Stu Ball and Happy Christmas.
Right. Well, we're getting to the end, so I wanted George to have one final blast. So I went with Isn't It a Pity?
Oh, nice.
I understand your reasons for not including it, but I just figured it was a song that they noodled around with during the Let It Be sessions. So I just figured, put that on. It's a good... I kind of saw this as, that's like the end of the album. That's the last song. Until they come back for an encore.
Oh, okay.
And the encore, because I personally feel you can't top this song, is Backseat of My Car.
Oh, okay.
And that just might be personal bias on my account, because I just love that song so much.
Sure.
But that's the closing track.
I could see those two slotted together. That's an interesting thing, especially because I always thought Isn't It a Pity was directly addressed to Paul, at least the way version 1 is arranged, where it's sort of this parallel universe, Hey Jude.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's really cool.
And I make a point of including the first version on my compilation, even though it's longer and probably wouldn't fit on a vinyl album. But at least not this vinyl album.
Right, right.
But it's just so much more powerful than version 2.
That's interesting. I wonder at what point did Paul hear it and did his ears prick up and go, hey, wait a minute.
Exactly.
Those are na-na-na-nas he's doing there.
Well, Wah Wah, I always saw, and I don't know if this is like a mind-blowing revelation or observation, but I always saw Wah Wah as George's answer to I've Got a Feeling, the guitar opening.
That's interesting. Yeah, that picking.
Because isn't that what caused the argument between them during the Let It Be sessions? Is that was the song that they were sort of like bickering over?
Oh, the I'll play whatever you want me to?
Yeah.
It was Two of Us when they're still doing that fast arrangement of it.
Okay.
But the part that where he really sticks the knife in, and apparently Peter Jackson says, well, I'm going to show all 6 minutes of this and everybody will see it was not this terrible, devastating thing.
Right.
I agree with him.
Yeah.
When you do hear the whole context of it, it's not this big, ugly thing that became so magnified by being in the Let It Be film, especially when you trim it down to that 30 seconds where it just seems like really cold. But actually, the part that I thought was where Paul's really putting the boot in a sensitive area is it's just like Hey Jude.
Right.
When I was telling you, no echoing guitar lines or whatever. So
it's funny you mentioned this. Yeah, because my daughter and we just got done watching the Beatles anthology. I have the DVD set.
Oh, wow.
And I'm bringing her up to speed on all this because the McCartney documentaries, Get Back is coming. So I showed her the whole history and we got to that moment with the I'll play whatever you want me to play. And I've explained the whole context to her. and I haven't seen it in years, but when Paul mentions the Hey Jude part, you see, it's almost like slowly I turn. I mean, you get this whole reaction from George.
Niagara Falls. Yeah.
And I point that out to my daughter. I said, look at George. Look at George's reaction when he mentions Hey Jude. I said, that's when he completely...
He's triggered.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny you mentioned that.
How old is your daughter?
She's 18.
Okay. So she's sophisticated and adult enough to pick up on the way humans interact with each other and the body language and all that stuff.
Yeah, and with me as her father, I've kind of prepped her for all this stuff throughout her whole life.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's cool.
I've seen Wawa as sort of George's answer to I've Got a Feeling, at least the guitar lick. So I really wanted that to be included there. So yeah, so that was my second one.
Okay. So the one that I've got here on tap, I guess would have come out, depending on the requirements of the marketplace, maybe 72, which, as we know, was not a great Beatle year. George was dealing with Bangladesh still, didn't do any recording really until the end of the year. We started getting Material World ready. Ringo did the one single. Paul was getting Wings together, getting him on the road, doing the touring that he was doing, and did Give Ireland Back to the Irish at the beginning of the year, and then Hi, 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 Sea Moon at the end of the year. And then John did New York City. So enough said. Not a great Beatle year. Yeah. So nonetheless, what I put together, and I provisionally called mine, because probably like the Beatles that way, we're up to the last minute, you're still changing. And this one, I call it The Greatest, simply because the Beatles like to be perverse. And people buy thinking, what, is this the greatest hits? I don't know any of these songs. But you'll get the logic when I get to it. But it kicks off with Back Off Boogaloo, because that, of course, is a kickoff song. And then goes into John, God Save Us, the, Elastic Oz Band song that is so non-specific. I guess when he wrote it, he intended to be God Save Oz, but then he realized nobody in America knew what Oz magazine was. But if you've heard the demo with him singing it, I thought it was a nice little throwaway rocker that he shouldn't have thrown away. You know, it's a perfectly good track that put the Beatles on it, you get something even more decent out of it. Followed by Dear Boy, a song that even though John took umbrage at it, thought it was about him. It's not. It's about Linda's first husband. And just that beautiful arrangement. And of course, he and Linda pull it off great with all those harmonies that they stacked, this sort of Brian Wilson production type thing. I thought it would be interesting to hear the other Beatles on it. Followed by Oh My Love, which again, you've got George on that, on the Imagine album treatment of it, but I thought it would be nice to stick a Paul harmony in there. And then extending that little mellow groove a little bit longer, a song that I thought was a real standout on the album that it came out on, but that was in 73, although it is known to have been an outtake from Ram in 71, and that's Little Lamb Dragonfly.
Right, okay.
A nice, sweet little acoustic Paul song to follow John's sweet acoustic song. And then as the side ends, segue into a Harrison song that just got lost in the mix, I Live For You. A nice little picking song with some great pedal steel on it. Now, a song opening side 2 that we know existed in 1970 when John started demoing it. But again, he gives it over to Ringo. I'm the Greatest. So now you have, for the first time in the Beatles canon, Ringo with 2 vocals on a single album.
Right.
But it's a John song this time. Followed by another piano song from Paul, a B-side, Little Woman Love.
Okay.
Which it was always been a favorite of mine. That was, I guess, again, a leftover from the Ram sessions before it came out as the flip of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Then we got Jealous Guy. Are you familiar with the quote where Paul is saying somewhere that John told him he wrote it about him?
Yes.
Yeah. So I thought that,
which,
even though it's not sniping, it's like sort of the opposite.
Right.
He has said in, I guess, the Playboy interview, when he talks about the Walrus, Paul in Glass Onion, here, Paul, have this stroke because I'm leaving you.
Yeah.
Here it's like a mea culpa. Yeah. I should have been such a dick. I should have even thought about writing How Do You Sleep. Follow that by Our Beloved Wawa.
Yep.
And then Eat It Home, which everybody loves, barely.
Right.
And then the finale to the album is a nice little jam that now we get to hear all 4 Beatles on, I Don't Want to Be a Soldier.
Wow.
Because...
interesting.
Yeah, I just always love that one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because we both picked Eat It Home, and just recently I revised my Imagine the Beatles track list because originally I couldn't decide which Paul. I had 5 Paul songs originally.
Oh, okay.
5 from Paul, 4 from John, and I think 3 from George. And I don't think I had anything from Ringo, just because there wasn't any room. And just a few days ago, I decided I couldn't choose between Eat at Home and Heart of the Country. And ultimately, I chose to drop Heart of the Country, and I popped in Back Off Boogaloo.
That's right. Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah.
Just because I figured at that point in the Beatles' career, you have to have even though Ringo didn't have a song on Let It Be, by this point, Ringo's got to have a song.
Yes.
So
because he's got a film career at this time.
Exactly.
Blind man.
So
200 motels.
I love Heart of the Country also, but it's just funny that I feel like I made the right choice by hearing how much you love Eat at Home. I made the right choice to keep that.
Oh, yeah.
Keep that in the mix.
Yeah, that definitely, to me, it fits on a Beatle album because I think it's the kind of thing that would have made it as a single.
Yeah.
And I know in some countries it was, but not in the main markets of Britain and the US. So it made sense to me as something that I can just imagine the other Beatles really getting into. And then John complaining, well, Paul should have let me sing it.
Right. And that's the other thing. I read somewhere where John actually did like that song.
Yes.
So I was like, okay, that sealed the deal. So, yeah.
So there's a lot of cool stuff here. And I think that between the two of us, if I say so myself, there's some smart choices here compared to what I've seen out there. And, you know, I already mentioned Spencer Leigh. There's other people out there. And the same blog, and I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but this guy that was writing was talking about other people's choices for these post-70 Beatle albums. And there's some guy, I guess, was a science fiction writer. And it seemed like there was a lot of people who liked to put Instant Karma on a Beatles album.
Yes.
And in my head, it didn't make sense to do that. It had to be a John song. Even though it's got George on it, it still screams John. It's something that sets the table for Plastic Ono Band with the Phil Spector production on it. There's that whole school of thought that it's being sung as a message to Paul, that you're probably familiar with, that was been in the ether this year, starting with Fab Four Con Jam. But anyway, I didn't see that as Beatle material, which is no reflection on the esteem I have for it.
Right. Same here. I mean, I love the song. Going by the rules that I have in my head, I mean, technically speaking, it came out while the Beatles were technically still together. And it would have come out no matter what. So that was out there by the time that they would have regrouped. And so, yeah, it's a John solo song. And there it must remain.
Yes. There was a Ringo interview, I want to say in January of 70. It's when he's in LA. He's promoting Magic Christian. He does that thing on Laugh-In. And I think there was one press conference he did when he was in town. And he's talking about the Beatles' plans for 1970.
Right.
And again, this is, you know, supposedly John has quit the group months before. And I don't think Ringo's fudging. I think it was the real state of things that he says something like, yeah, we're each working on our individual things, but we're going to reconvene later this year and see where we're at. And makes it sound like very much there was going to be a group thing in the offing, at least to talk about by the year's end of 1970, before things took a turn in reality. And so, to me, it's a very easy thing to figure if that had happened, if the Beatles had gotten back together, that absolutely It Don't Come Easy would have been a Beatle track.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. I think it's in the Peter Doggett book. And this might have been just a legal ploy, and it probably was. But supposedly, John, George, and Ringo sent word to Paul in late 1970 that they were going to go back into the studio and record, and he's welcome to join them.
Yes.
If he wants. And they were laying a trap for him, because if he did show up, that meant that he considered himself still part of the Beatles. Right.
That story circulates, and I don't know what to make of that, because it only makes sense if it happens after January 1st, because he files the lawsuit December 31st, right? 1970.
Right.
So up until that point, for all their keeping a distance and him talking in the press about this limping a dog of a story, when the Beatles get back together, no, they won't. There's no legal issue at stake here yet, because he hasn't filed suit. So I've seen that, and it's interesting that early 1970 seems to be a bit of a mystery as when exactly was it recorded, because it's clearly around when it gets issued in, what is it, March or April of 1971. And by that time, It Don't Come Easy had been tracked like a year before. That was in March of 70, the same time he's wrapping up work on Sentimental Journey. Apparently, there's a take somewhere, which I would love to hear, with Eric Clapton on it, when George wasn't around for the session, and they went ahead and did a take. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I thought the last time that Eric would take George's place. Nor the first. So,
right.
Yeah. So if that exists, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. But, absolutely.
Yeah. So just some things are just not as well documented as they should be. But I try to, in my inclusion of things like Since You Came to Me and God Save Us, try to pick stuff that was out there that maybe was undervalued, that could have worked in the hands if Paul caught wind of it. It's like, oh, John, let's develop this. Let's do something with this, you know? Yeah. So if I were to try to justify everything that went into my decision making, some people might think, huh? But it all made sense to me at the moment. You know?
Right. Yeah, I mean, all this stuff makes sense except they keep changing it. Yeah, I keep changing, tweaking,
it's so easy to
tweaking.
do.
Yeah.
There was another one I saw online, and this was somebody, again, it was the guy that was blogging this that was talking about, there's the example, whatever that Ethan Hawke movie was, I can't remember the name of it right now, where he put together a mixtape.
Right.
The Black Album, that was his solo Beatle compendium.
Yep.
So everybody does this stuff. And so he was talking about his own, where he added as like a little left turn, not predictable thing in a post-breakup Beatles album, the McCartney song 1882. And that's the one that was an outtake from Red Rose Speedway when it was originally going to be a double album that they actually performed live a handful of times. If you're not familiar with it, it's this Dickensian story of this kid who goes to prison for stealing bread or something like that. It's like Les Mis in song. I thought that was an interesting choice. What else is there in the double record of Red Rose Speedway that might be pillaged that's of value? And I took a look and was like, no, not really much of anything.
I had the same reaction.
You want to keep the Beatles to a certain level.
Yeah, I mean, I took a look at the playlist that Ethan Hawke put together for the Black Album, and this isn't a criticism of it, but he didn't labor over it with rules in his head the way I did.
No. It seemed incredibly random, didn't it?
Exactly. And it's like, oh, it's a bunch of good songs by all four of them thrown together.
The biggest thing that impressed me about it was the depth of his knowledge.
Yeah.
He's clearly a hardcore because he was digging up all kinds of stuff. I'm trying to remember what was, he had something in there from, was it Return to Pepperland?
I believe
it was something obscure McCartney unreleased. It's like, wow, okay, that's pretty impressive. You're not just going for the obvious.
I think it was Return to Pepperland, actually.
Yeah. So that impressed me that this guy's walking around with a working knowledge, but as far as sequencing it or justifying it or having any kind of rules, I didn't get that impression at all. It was a jumble of eras and all kinds of material that I'd have to sit there and think, does this really slot well next to the other track? I'm not sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the things that I really try to go for. Like I said before, is do they flow well into each other? Do they reflect each other even thematically, even though they're not necessarily supposed to, weren't intended to? Again, I looked at other Beatles albums to see how they sequenced. And again, going back to my first compilation, Odds and Ends, I just totally used Revolver as my pattern. If you're going to crib from the best.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And nobody would have probably picked up on it, even if they had it consciously in their heads.
Exactly.
Yeah. To a point, I'm not sure at what point George Martin no longer had the control over sequencing, because we know during the White Album sessions, it's John and Paul that stayed up 24 hours that were doing that.
Yeah.
So clearly at some point he lost that opportunity or that role. But one of the thoughts that was occurring to me was, what if the Beatles had carried on? Would they have stuck with George Martin? Would they have switched to another producer? Would it have been Spector? Would Paul have gone along with that? Or would they do what's common practice, especially on Ringo albums, is different producers for different tracks? How might that have played out?
It's so funny because I was thinking about this just last night as I was going to bed. I think that they may well have parted company with George Martin going into the 70s. I don't think Paul would have gone with Phil Spector.
No.
I resolved to think that either, number one, they would have gone with separate producers, which basically I think would have been the end of the band.
Yes.
That would have been it.
It's exactly the conclusion I came to, is like, because then it becomes like a corporate project. It's no longer, there's no unifying thing other than they're occupying the same piece of vinyl.
Ultimately, the thought that I came up with was they would have taken a cue from the Beach Boys. And from that moment forward, all the albums would have said produced by the Beatles. Yeah.
That's what I ultimately came to, is like, we know, starting at the White Album at least, that they're pretty much on their own, producing themselves. I had thought Chris Thomas, would that have been somebody they all could have agreed on? Because he did eventually work with Paul later on, and they apparently got along with him well during the White Album. But I thought, no, I think they have really usurped that role for themselves by that time if they'd kept going. And they did. And the thing is, George uses Spector basically the one time, twice if you count Bangladesh.
Mhm.
John sticks with them a little bit longer, and then by Mind Games, he does it on his own. And that was sort of his practice producing album because he got much better by the time he got around doing Walls and Bridges. I think that the impulse to produce themselves, if you had John, let's bang it out fast and move on to the next thing, and Paul, who's going to sit there at the board and craft things and get the sounds right, it would have made a nice balance for each other, as they had so many times before to that point. George, too, I guess, from what we know, with All Things Must Pass, he'd said that in using Spector, I ended up doing more work than if I'd undertaken it myself from the beginning.
Right.
Just because Spector is Spector. I definitely saw that as something that if you're going to put out a collective Beatle album in the 1970s, they'd have to have handled themselves in whatever fashion. Because I was trying to think, well, who would they have all agreed on? And for a minute, I was thinking, what about Roy Halley? And I'm thinking, no, John never would have gone for him.
Mhm.
You know, the guy who was producing Simon and Garfunkel
Right.
and other
Right.
stuff. So there was nobody I can think that, given the diversity of their tastes and approaches and styles, that would have worked. So ultimately, by default, it would have to be them.
Yeah, I think I came down to most likely them, or maybe they would have stuck with George Martin just out of appreciation and loyalty.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was much more likely that they would have just changed it to produced by the Beatles.
Yeah. Now, if we were to take this exercise into the 80s, I could see maybe them approaching somebody after having reached a point where we know George by 79 is looking for an outside producer, and Paul by 80, 81 goes back to George Martin because he's thinking, I need somebody that's going to stand up to me and tell me no. And, John, Jack Douglas.
Right.
So they recognized at some point, maybe we should. The person I thought of, if there was a Beatle album in the 80s, that might be cool, because one of the few people that, best I can tell, was respected by every one of them and was a successful producer, was Dave Edmunds.
Wow.
You've got him on Broad Street working with Paul. John admired I Hear You Knocking back in 70. George certainly dug him. Ringo worked with him at least once. I think it was that take of I Call Your Name.
Mhm.
So I thought, here's a guy that I think they could all agree on if they wanted to go that route.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and how it would have been. George, I thought, I always had this fantasy that had he been a little more serious and diligent about making records, he made them when he felt like it past a certain point.
Mhm.
But the fact that he looked for an outside producer when he did the self-titled album, I thought around that era, wouldn't it have been amazing if he'd gotten Lindsey Buckingham to produce it?
Oh, wow.
Both these great guitar heads, both great pop sensibilities. And I think that Lindsey could have drug him along into something a little more modern and timeless at the time, because he did miracle work on the people he did produce. Going to Bob Welch and digging up that old Fleetwood Mac song, Sentimental Lady, and making it into something stronger than it had been. The raw bones were there, and he made it into something more commercial and solid. Even Walter Egan, he did good work with. So it would have been nice to get somebody who understood the intricacies of guitar playing to handle George.
What do you think about, I mean, I know he didn't exactly set the world on fire when he turned in his versions of Get Back, the two versions of Get Back, but after Who's Next, do you think Glenn Johns would have ever had a shot?
That's an interesting one, because certainly by the 70s, he had the track record of success.
Yeah.
With The Who and Zeppelin and Eagles, first few albums with those, which was really weird. So that showed that he had a grasp of bands that do harmonies. It could have fit. That's a really good point, because he's British. He knows the Beatles. The Beatles liked him.
Right.
You could hear John praising him and thanking him for their work. I think it was not any lack on his part necessarily that they didn't agree to his Get Back album, so much as they had come up with this concept that nobody could have lived up to, and nobody did. Spector had to completely rewrite everything to make a sellable thing out of it. And then come 2003, when they do Let It Be Naked, purportedly getting back to that Get Back live concept, there's all kinds of tinkering going on there, and the result just sounds, so to my ears, bloodless and digital.
I know.
It's like it sucked all the warmth and humanity out of it.
I have to say that's my preferred version these days over the
Oh, is it?
over the Spector version, just because I just felt like he just went so over the top on some of that stuff.
And maybe it's just because it's what I'm used to, that I like to hear it a certain way.
Sure.
But I thought there were certain things he did on that. Fixing Dig a Pony, taking that clunky out of tune intro and outro,
Yeah.
it's great. Stretching out I Me Mine,
Mhm.
beautiful. Now it can break the 90-second mark. but just the nice little touch of giving us just enough dig it than we need. That's all we need. And then pivoting into Let It Be. I thought that was genius.
Yeah.
That's like the greatest thing on there. But I happily would have dumped Maggie May for Don't Let Me Down.
Of course. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Boggles the mind.
Yes. It's not even in the film. I'm not quite sure what the justification was.
Yeah, that was a very weird choice.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess that version of the album really wanted to play up John's humor. So it throws in a lot of, I dig a pigmy, but, and I guess that was like one of those things where it's just John having fun, and they really wanted to play that up.
Too bad they couldn't stick white power in there somewhere. Get off. That was hilarious. I think it's interesting that for the mutual admiration they had for each other, that Paul and Brian Wilson in their prime, and when I say prime, I guess Brian's was during the Beatle years, and that kind of just went away for a long time till he recouped some measure of mojo decades later. But I wonder if it would have maybe drawn him out sooner, pre-Landy, if Paul had approached him and said, hey, Brian, let's work on something together. Because they seem to have a lot of commonality in their musical sensibility. And maybe had Paul been not so preoccupied with Wings at the time and a very specific mission, if he'd considered something like that, what those two working together could have done. That
would have been incredible. And Paul actually, I'm sure, have you seen the Beach Boys 1976 TV special?
Is that the one where the birthday party is there and Paul's around?
Yes, and Paul and Linda are there.
Uh-huh.
When you were just saying all that, I just got this impression of Paul being there, taking a look at the shape Brian was in at that time and saying, yeah, I don't think I can work with this guy.
That might have been enough, yeah. So, yeah, it's too much of a fantasy to think that could have happened. But I'm just thinking in musical terms how it's something would have been amazing to have happen. Is there anybody you would have liked to have seen work more with John?
Bob Dylan.
That's interesting because I never was 100% convinced that they got each other. There was kind of speaking past each other, maybe a bit of territorialness because of their status as songwriters, but that's interesting.
I think they would have tried to outdo each other, and there would have been a lot of musical machismo in that room, but I'd like to think that it would have forced them to really up their game for each other.
Yeah.
And John said he wanted to produce Dylan. So,
was that in the 70s?
That was in the 70s, yeah.
Oh.
So he said Dylan was somebody he would really like to produce, that he thought he could get him back to where he should be at that point.
Was that in the 1980 round of interviews?
No, I think it was
Lost Weekend?
Early to mid. Yes, Lost Weekend period.
Okay,
yes.
Okay.
That's when he said that.
He's looking at blood on the tracks and thinking, I can help this man.
He was producing Nilsson. He saw blood on the microphone, so it's
right,
close enough.
I thought that had the Lost Weekend, quote unquote, not ended when it did, wouldn't have been interesting to see maybe this extended collaboration with Bowie continue.
Yeah.
I mean, really develop into something. They got one funk track done and that cover of Across the Universe for, whatever value you attribute to it. But being in the studio together, I think would have been an interesting thing with them, especially given John's sort of admiration for funk around that time. He has a great production of Mick singing Too Many Cooks. Fame is just a sort of a great dance track. And I could see him going further that way had there been some kind of enabling going on. But Elton, I thought they collaborated well for what they did together, but I think they were almost cut too much from the same cloth for them to really give much to each other.
I think maybe we would have seen some more lasting stuff with the Hollywood Vampires.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Put Alice Cooper in there somewhere.
Exactly.
Who did some amazing stuff in the 70s with Bob Ezrin. That would have been up that game a little, especially after the band fell apart in 74 or whenever it was. Yeah, they clearly got along.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, maybe John and Mick would have worked on something together.
That would have been interesting too, especially with Keith kind of being hobbled during some of those years.
Exactly.
If he had done his solo album then, instead of keep going with the Stones, 1975, that would have been interesting. Lennon Jagger, that would have been something.
Yeah.
All the what ifs, man.
Yeah.
I wonder if they ever look back and had that thought. It's like, boy, we should have gotten busy while we had the moment.
I don't know how you couldn't. I think there's a lot of looking back with that kind of thinking,
Yeah. We look at it from a perspective of fans and the product they did give us, the work that they did, and don't see or experience the way they did everything that went on around it.
Right.
That lifestyle that Keith Moon succumbs to. Harry Nilsson dies prematurely. They all were hitting that life so hard. I don't know how that would have impacted their productivity had they had the will to do more with it. Hard to say.
Yeah, very true. I let you know, I guess it was last week or a week or two ago, that knowing that we were going to have this conversation inspired me to buckle down and come up with a third Beatles compilation.
Okay.
Which I didn't think I had any juice left in me. I didn't think they had any juice left in them,
Right.
that I could pull from. But I was just inspired knowing that we were going to be talking about this. And I threw it together and I listened to it yesterday and it worked surprisingly well. At least it surprised me. And about 20 minutes before we started talking tonight, I made a change to it.
Oh, no.
Which I'm going to have to talk to you about because I want to get your input.
Okay.
And this one I saw as kind of like a concept album because I saw as the songs were coming together and as I was sequencing them, I was like, there's a theme emerging here. So I called it The Beatles. And this is sort of like a nod to Ringo, whose favorite catchphrase now is peace and love, peace and love.
Right.
So I called it The Beatles Piece of Love, and I spelled it Piece, because it's an album offering. It's a piece of love.
Oh, that's good.
Because a lot of the songs are about love. We start with Mind Games, which ends with I want you to make love, not war.
Yeah.
We go into Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth by George.
Oh, it's thematic.
That's where it's going. It just kind of fell into place. Then, because I had to go with the best that Paul had at that time, 72, 73, My Love, which I can see John rolling his eyes when...
Right.
But it was a big hit for Paul. You want a hit associated with your album. And if John wants to do interviews where he gets to slam Paul, he's got a song right there he could slam him with publicly.
And George having a crack at that solo.
Yes. Oh, my God, yes.
Yeah.
Because certainly Paul gave Henry McCullough gave him so much hell over that.
Right. Well, now that you've done it, Henry, you have to play it exactly that same way every time on stage.
Yeah. And then, and this is the part I wanted to, I'll get back to it, but originally I had it as I'm the Greatest comes in for the Ringo song. Only because John wrote it. You've got John, George, and Ringo performing on it. It's the closest thing to a Beatles track we got in the 70s. It breaks the format a little bit, but I just went with it. I followed that up with Some People Never Know, which I know a lot of people think it's about John. And I know I was supposed to leave off songs that reflect on the bad relations between them and all of that.
Yeah, I don't think it's that John specific. I think people absolutely can read it that way.
Yeah.
Because there's a line in there about sleeping at night. It's like, oh, how do you sleep? Rejoinder. But
right, exactly.
I do think it predates How Do You Sleep.
Okay. All right. Well, then great. It works even better then. So Some People Never Know. And then that follows up. And I told you before that I like to have, as much as I can, the Paul and John songs reflect each other.
Yeah.
I followed that up with I Know, I Know.
Oh, yeah. Love it.
And that ends side one. Now, just to sort of go back a little bit, and I was thinking about this again, like 20 minutes before we started talking. Instead of I'm the Greatest for the Ringo track, if I put in Photograph as the Ringo track, that's all about you coming home to me, when you're coming home to me. And then Some People Never Know is I'll be coming home.
Ooh.
So
wow.
Photograph could lead into Some People Never Know, which leads into I Know, I Know.
Wow. I'm getting chills.
I'll be coming home to stay. And it's some people, but Photograph is all about when, I wish you were coming home. I wish you were coming home.
Yeah, exactly.
And the response is, so yeah, that kind of blew my mind too.
Nice.
So what do you think? Should I keep I'm the Greatest or replace it with Photograph?
Photograph.
Okay.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah.
I'll have to figure out a fourth compilation to stick I'm the Greatest on. Anyway, going into side two, we start off with Apple Scruffs, which I've been trying to get onto one of these compilations for years now. I think finally it works here.
It's a nice opener.
Yeah, it's a great side two opener. It's a great album opener. And then It's So Hard by John. All of the Paul songs up until this point have been really sort of soft and about love and very mellow. I wanted to show what Paul could do. I wanted to give him some balls.
Okay.
A real ballsy song. So I kind of dug a little deeper and I put on, I went with Oh Woman, Oh Why.
Oh, nice. In my parallel universe, I stuck that on McCartney, even though it's technically on a sequence, just because it's sort of semi-experimental.
Okay, yeah. I figured of the two songs that I chose for Paul, and I wish I could remember the other one right now, I figured that's the one where John would say, yeah, go with that one.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah, it's got that screech.
Yeah.
And then Tight As.
Uh-huh.
Then I go into The Art of Dying.
Ooh, wow.
Which is this song about cosmic and about the universe and all that. And I just figured, you know what? Let's bring things back to earth. Let's end on a hopeful note. So I ended with Paul's Tomorrow.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's sort of a commonality between both of our selections, just spread in different ways.
Yeah.
Cool.
So that is the third one. And if I could remember, if I can remember the Paul song that was in contention, I'll shout it out.
Okay. Feel free.
It dropped out of my head.
Clearly, it just really underscores the richness of this material we've got to work with, which is nice.
Yeah.
That might have been diluted a little bit if it was on these uneven records. I'm not saying all of them were, but I think alongside material from the other Beatles, it makes it that much more in the spotlight, more standout, contrasting a John and a Paul song back to back or whatever.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. And if they'd stayed together, could you imagine what Wildlife might have sounded like, or Sometime in New York City? I swear, I poured over Sometime in New York City. I wanted to get something from that era. There was not one song I could consider. Not one.
Yeah, I mean, my go-to for that is the New York City song, which is nice. You know, it's kind of an updated ballad of John and Yoko, but it's a little too Lennon's, John and Yoko specific that I didn't really see a group version of that.
And also, just the subject matter. Who's to say John would have even been in New York City to write about it if the Beatles had stayed together?
That's true.
So that's what kind of really dropped that song off of my consideration.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
Very good. I did have something going into 73. In my thought process, I just wanted to have it in my pocket in case I needed it, but didn't do as extensive thought and justification. It was just like, what songs would slot well alongside each other from that era without being too centric to the Beatle that wrote them, but would survive nice group treatments. So this was a 10-cut album, 5 songs per side. And I didn't, this would have been untitled by the Beatles because I just didn't come up with anything yet. What I put together is, so a 73-ish album would open with Mind Games, but as it was in its original state, where it was still the original lyrics, Make Love, Not War.
Okay.
And in this spirit, this is the year that they do the ceasefire in Vietnam, and it would be sort of a nostalgic piece, kind of looking back on the anti-war movement, and now that peace is imminent, it would be a kind of a reflective thing from John rather than the anthemic thing that did come out as Mind Games later on, which was, of course, named for the book that he read, Mind Games, but that was a whole different thing. Followed by the George track, nearly a single, but wasn't, Don't Let Me Wait Too Long.
Right.
And then keeping the 12-string vibe going into Photograph.
Okay.
So those are a couple mid to slow tempoed songs. We have to mix it up with something faster moving. We got Paul then parachuting in with Hell on Wheels.
Oh, okay.
A nice rocker.
Yeah.
Followed by album side closing John rocker, Tight Ass.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Yeah. And then I have him opening up side 2 with a song that I thought get John and Paul together on this, and it would really make something nice, One Day at a Time.
Okay.
I thought it was an okay John song, and then Elton did a remake of it, of all things. But I thought it would be an interesting thing because it's kind of in Paul's wheelhouse as far as production goes.
Mm-hmm.
Followed by Give Me Love, which again is not so filled with religiosity on George's part. I mean, it's implicit, but it's not explicit that it could work as group material.
Right.
Followed by Bluebird from Paul.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then keeping that acoustic vibe going, I got George's Deep Blue, which is a deep cut that most people don't know. And I was thrilled to death when that clip showed up when they remastered the Bangladesh concert a few years ago of them actually rehearsing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a song that kind of got lost in the shuffle. And then I've got closing the side, and again, pointing out that I didn't really finish this off. It's only 10 cuts, but this was how I conceived it so far, ending with I Know, I Know.
Okay. A lot of crossover.
Because that's got a nice ending to it, and it definitely, best I could tell, I would make the argument that John was thinking about Paul when he wrote it.
Right. I know that you felt that way, yeah. And again...
Yeah. In fact, you can call the album No More Crying.
Okay, well... That's one of the reasons why I positioned it after Some People Never Know, to have the two songs kind of talk to each other.
Yes, the dialogue, yeah.
Two things. One is I could not bring myself to break up the Band on the Run album.
Oh, okay. Cypress Act to you?
Yeah, so I mean, I thought about it. I really, really did think about pulling songs off of Band on the Run. I was like, I can't do it. I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
See, if I were to do that, which I just did, I pulled a couple things off of it, there was so much material he had around that you could swap out. And yeah, it could be considered artistic vandalism because it's so perfect as it is to cut something from it. But on the other hand, you had those B-sides. You had Country Dreamer, perfectly fine song, which would have been nice to use. You've got some of the stuff that shows up in one hand clapping, like I'll Give You a Ring, Suicide, things that were around the studio take of Stoyley. So he had stuff that could have filled that space, whether you accept it as equal to the greatness that is the Band on the Run we know or not. That's in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. But that's how I was able to vandalize that and justify it.
By the way, I do remember the song now that the Paul song that I was trying to choose between Oh Woman, Oh Why and A Love for You.
Oh, very interesting. Very good. I like that.
And ultimately, I chose Oh Woman, Oh Why. What do you think?
Okay. I think that's one that John would have got his preference for sure.
Which one?
I mean, they're both good.
Okay.
But I think I always saw that as sort of in the vein of Why Don't We Do It in the Road?
Yes.
And that's the one that John always expressed hurt and resentment that he wasn't included in the recording of. And Paul just went off in the studio and did it. So, yeah, it absolutely makes sense that Oh Woman, Oh Why would be something that John would have wanted included had there been a situation that would have provided that.
Yeah, and the other thing is, again, with the sequencing and the way the songs flowed into each other, A Love for You just felt like it was odd man out. It just, none of the songs flowed into it well, whereas Oh Woman, Oh Why, it did, for some reason.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's kind of what was my dilemma with High, 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 was I wanted to stick that in somewhere. But to me, and maybe it's just my own mental block, I couldn't see it slotting alongside something. To me, it was too much of a standalone. I don't know why. I just didn't see it like another song before it or after it that worked. It just seemed like it was either an opening song or a closing song, but I didn't see it as an album track. So I was like, screw it. That's his solo single.
Exactly. Yeah. B-side.
Yeah. And to this day, I'll never understand the adoration out there for Steam Moon. It's like,
oh my God.
Yeah.
I mean, I love Paul, but and when he did it in concert, I had to turn to my wife and I was like, I don't know why he's doing this one either.
Bathroom break. That's something. So it is very interesting that we got this material to work with that I think we are able to justify it being Beatle product one way or another. And it really speaks to, had they not allowed a business situation to break them that way, they had all the room in the world to do the solo personal stuff. John could do his Plastic Ono Band. He could do his political stuff. George could do his religious stuff. And they had enough commonality, I think, in the material they were churning out that any number of tunes would have benefited from having the other Beatles on them, even if they're doing an album every 2 years, every 3 years, something like that, collectively, and doing the solo stuff between them. I will argue that forever. But I think it's justified by just looking at the body of work we've got and thinking, man, if we had a George solo on this, how much the song would have been elevated from what it is now, just another album track.
I agree with you 100%. I have nothing I could add to that because you said it perfectly.
Well, this was a fun topic, and thank you for coming up with it.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, I mean, for me, this all started, when I read an old interview from, after John had died. I read an interview with him, and his exact quote was, look, if you want the Beatles back so bad, just take the best songs off of our solo albums and put them together, and boom, you got the Beatles again.
I have to put that at the beginning of the show. It's perfect.
Okay.
I'll find it.
You want me to say it again?
Yeah, cool. Did you ever own the album, The Beatles Tapes? The David Wigg interviews?
A friend of mine in high school who was a huge Beatles fan might have played it for me.
Well, I could hear it in my head. He's got 2 interviews on that record. One's from 69, where he's in peace and love mode, and the other one's in 71. And you can guess which one he is like super irritated in.
Yeah.
It's 71.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it goes on to say, if you want to say that Yoko split up the Beatles, then why don't you thank her for all the great music that's come out since we split?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. I read that interview too.
Yeah.
Or at least I heard it or read it. But that's where it all started for me. I read that line. I was like, Yeah, why the hell not? Let's do it. And then I found out how many songs predated the breakup
Yes.
that ended up on this. And that's where this all started for me in 1986, 87, when I was in high school. And I've been playing with it ever since.
You know, if we had continued this, I remember from the onset when I was trying to like get a grand 10,000 foot view of what I was going to put into these things and what I could justify as material that existed, not unique to the solo years, but maybe something that they were carrying around since the 60s. And then I remembered that the opening cut on 33 1/3, Woman Don't You Cry For Me, which is such an atypical George song, but he said he'd written it in 69. I'm thinking, really? The same year as Something and Here Comes the Sun, you wrote this? Because it's so funky. You know, it starts with Willie Weeks playing bass. And I thought, man, if this had come out in, say, 74 and McCartney was playing it or something, how amazing would that have been? As a tax man, George gets the opening slot because it's so cool and so perfect. But I didn't extend the thought process that deep, but next time.